Welcome to WW2 History Tales. I hope you're doing well wherever you are watching from. In the unforgiving skies of World War II, a single second could separate survival from silence. Engines roared through clouds heavy with smoke and fear, while young men faced impossible choices under relentless fire. In moments of chaos, courage was tested, doubt took hold, and lives were changed forever by decisions made in the blink of an eye. Some of these moments were never meant to be remembered, yet their echoes still shape how history understands the cost of war. Tonight's story begins with one such moment, hidden in the shadows until now. Before the story begins, please write in the comments where you are watching from. And before we start, don't forget to support this channel by liking the video and subscribing to WW2 History Tales. Your support means a great deal and helps us continue bringing you powerful and meaningful World War II stories. In the early years of World War II, control of the sky meant control of everything below it. Cities burned, supply lines vanished, and entire armies were shaped by battles fought thousands of feet above the ground. For the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, early dominance bred confidence. Their pilots were veterans of swift victories, flying sleek, deadly aircraft that had crushed opposition across Europe. They believed they understood air combat better than anyone else. So when American forces introduced a new fighter into European theater, German pilots did not react with fear. They reacted with laughter. The aircraft looked wrong. It was enormous, thick-bodied, and heavy. It lacked the elegant lines of German fighters. Its wide wings and bulky frame made it seem slow, almost primitive. Luftwaffe pilots whispered the same judgment again and again. This American plane would never survive real combat. Its designation was P-47 Thunderbolt. At first glance, their assumption seemed reasonable. The P-47 was one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever built. It carried a massive radial engine and layers of armor uncommon for fighters of time. To German pilots trained in precision dogfighting, the Thunderbolt looked like a mistake. Too slow to turn, too large to evade, too obvious a target in the sky. But what the Luftwaffe failed to understand was this. The P-47 was not designed to outmaneuver the enemy. It was designed to outlast them. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified, American bomber formations pushed deeper into hostile territory. Daylight raids exposed crews to relentless attacks, and losses mounted at an alarming rate. Fighters were needed that could escort bombers for long distances, survive heavy damage, and still deliver devastating firepower. The Thunderbolt was built for exactly that role. Beneath its wings were 8.50 caliber machine guns, synchronized to fire in a single, overwhelming burst. This was not a warning weapon. It was not meant to wound. When all 8 guns fired together, they created a concentrated storm of lead capable of tearing through aircraft frames, engines, and fuel systems in seconds. The first real encounters shattered German confidence. Expecting easy victories, Luftwaffe pilots attacked head-on. They fired, watched their rounds strike the Thunderbolt, and were stunned to see it keep flying. The P-47 absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Shrapnel ripped through its fuselage, wings were torn, engines damaged, yet many pilots still returned home alive. Then the Thunderbolt struck back. When an American pilot squeezed a trigger, the sky erupted. Tracer rounds streaked forward in a dense, converging pattern. German fighters that moments earlier felt invincible suddenly disintegrated under the sheer volume of fire. There was no graceful escape, no second chance. And if an enemy tried to flee, the Thunderbolt followed. The P-47 could dive faster than nearly anything in the sky. German pilots who attempted to escape downward found a massive American fighter plunging after them, screaming through the air like a falling fortress. Guns roaring as altitude turned into lethal speed. Mockery turned into caution. Caution turned into fear. By the time the Luftwaffe recognized the true nature of the Thunderbolt, it was already reshaping the air war over Europe. The aircraft they once dismissed was becoming a symbol of American air power, not elegant, not subtle, but brutally effective. And this was only the beginning of the story. For the men who flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, the first combat missions were not moments of triumph, but of uncertainty. Many of them were young, barely out of training. stepping into a sky already ruled by experienced Luftwaffe aces. Inside the cockpit, surrounded by metal and glass, they carried the weight of a single question. Would this massive aircraft truly protect them when the shooting started? As bomber formations crossed the English Channel and moved toward occupied Europe, the Thunderbolts formed up alongside them. From above, the formations looked orderly and calm. But every pilot knew the truth. Somewhere ahead, German fighters were already climbing, already preparing to strike. The first attacks came fast. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs cut through the clouds, diving toward the bombers with precision and confidence. To German pilots, the escorting Thunderbolts still appeared slow and awkward. Some ignored them entirely, focusing on the bombers, convinced the American fighters would be unable to respond in time. They were wrong. When the order came, P-47 pilots broke formation and charged forward. The Thunderbolt did not turn sharply like its enemies. Instead, it used momentum and firepower. Pilots lined up their shots carefully, knowing that when they fired, it would be decisive. 8 machine guns opened at once. The effect was immediate and shocking. The air ahead of the Thunderbolt filled with converging tracer rounds. German fighters flying into that fire found no room to escape. Aircraft that had survived countless engagements were suddenly torn apart. Engines failing, wings shredded, control lost in seconds. But victory did not come without cost. German pilots adapted quickly. They began attacking from above, exploiting the Thunderbolt's slower climb rate. In tight turns, the P-47 struggled to keep up. Some American pilots paid the price, their aircraft damaged, their confidence shaken. Radio chatter filled with urgent warnings, broken commands, and calls for help. Yet even in these moments, the Thunderbolt revealed its greatest strength. Pilots discovered that when things went wrong, they could dive. And once the nose pointed downward, the P-47 transformed. Gravity turned its weight into speed. The aircraft screamed to the sky, faster and faster, beyond the reach of German fighters that dared not follow too long. Many Luftwaffe pilots learned this lesson the hard way. They chased Thunderbolts into dives they could not control. Compressibility locked their controls. Wings failed. Altitude vanished. Some never recovered. Others pulled up just in time, shaken by how close death had come. Back at Allied airfields, returning Thunderbolts told their own stories. Planes landed riddled with holes, metal torn, paint scorched. Ground crews stared in disbelief as pilots climbed out unhurt. Aircraft that should have been lost had survived, bringing their pilots home again and again. Slowly, confidence grew. Pilots began to trust a Thunderbolt, not as a graceful fighter, but as a shield and a weapon. They learned when to fight, when to dive, and when to unleash the full fury of its guns. Mission after mission, experience replaced doubt. Across the front lines, the Luftwaffe took notice. Reports spread of an American fighter that refused to fall, an aircraft that could absorb punishment, strike with overwhelming force, and escape when others could not. The laughter that once followed the Thunderbolt's arrival faded from German briefing rooms. In its place was respect and growing concern. The air war over Europe was changing, and the Thunderbolt was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a constant presence in the sky, shaping every engagement it entered. And soon, its role would expand far beyond escort missions. As the air war over Europe evolved, the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt began to change. What started as a bomber escort mission slowly expanded into something far more dangerous and decisive. Allied commanders realized that the Thunderbolt's true strength was not only in the skies, but in what it could do closer to the ground. Down below, the war looked very different. Columns of German armor crawled along narrow roads. Supply convoys moved under cover of trees. Infantry units dug in, believing the greatest threat came from artillery or advancing ground forces. Few expected the sky itself to turn against them with such brutality. The Thunderbolt was built for this kind of war. With its thick armor, powerful engine, and unmatched durability, the P-47 could dive low and fast, absorbing ground fire that would shred lighter aircraft. Pilots began flying missions at terrifyingly low altitudes, skimming treetops and rooftops, searching for anything that moved. When they found it, there was no warning. The roar of the radial engine arrived first, echoing across fields and villages. Then came the guns. 8.50 caliber machine guns fired in long, controlled bursts, tearing through trucks, rail cars, artillery positions, and exposed troops. Vehicles exploded. Roads vanished in smoke and debris. What moments earlier had been an organized column dissolved into chaos. German soldiers learned to fear a sound they could not see. Veterans later described the Thunderbolt as a flying hammer. It struck hard, fast, and without mercy. Small arms fire bounced off its armored skin. Even anti-aircraft guns often failed to bring it down before it completed its attack and vanished back into clouds. For the pilots, these missions were among the most dangerous of the war. Flying low meant every rifle, every machine gun, every hidden cannon could be aimed directly at them. Tracer fire climbed in the ground like glowing fingers, reaching for the cockpit. One mistake, 1 second too long on a target, could mean death. Yet the Thunderbolt endured. Aircraft returned to base riddled with holes, engines damaged, wings torn apart, and still flying. Pilots stepped out shaking, knowing that no other fighter could have survived what they had just faced. Each successful mission deepened their trust in the aircraft and hardened their resolve. On the German side, panic spread. Supply lines that once operated by daylight moved only at night, if at all. Commanders reported entire units stalled, unable to advance under constant air attack. Morale suffered as soldiers realized there was no safe place, no reliable cover from the sky. The Thunderbolt was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become a force of control. By the time Allied ground forces pushed forward after major offensives, they often found German positions already shattered. Vehicles burned. Ammunition lay scattered. The battlefield had been shaped long before the first soldier arrived, shaped by an aircraft once dismissed as too slow, too heavy, too crude. In the skies above, German pilots now face a new reality. The P-47 did not need to chase them in elegant turns. It did not need to prove itself in classic dogfights. It simply needed to survive long enough to strike, and strike it did, again and again. The Thunderbolt had earned a reputation not through speed or beauty, but through destruction and endurance. And as the war pressed on, it would soon face its greatest test yet. Against a Luftwaffe growing more desperate, more dangerous, and with nothing left to lose. By the time the P-47 Thunderbolt became a familiar presence over Europe, the Luftwaffe was no longer the confident force it once had been. Losses had mounted, fuel was scarce, and experienced pilots were becoming harder to replace. Yet desperation has a way of sharpening resolve, and German air commanders were determined to push back against the growing Allied advantage. They changed their tactics. Veteran pilots were ordered to avoid prolonged engagements and instead strike with precision. New pilots, rushed through shortened training programs, were paired with experienced leaders and sent into air with limited preparation. The sky grew more dangerous, not because the enemy was stronger, but because they had less to lose. For Thunderbolt pilots, this shift was immediately felt. German fighters attacked in coordinated groups, striking from high altitude and retreating before the P-47 could respond. Others used the clouds as cover, emerging suddenly at close range. Radio chatter filled with urgent warnings as formations broke and reformed under pressure. The battles became brutal and unforgiving. There was no room for hesitation. American pilots learned to rely on discipline and teamwork, trusting their wingmen to watch blind spots and warn of incoming threats. When caught at a disadvantage, they returned to the one tactic that had saved them time and again, the dive. Once again, the Thunderbolt's weight became its greatest weapon. When a P-47 tipped forward and plunged toward the earth, it accelerated with terrifying speed. German pilots who followed found themselves fighting the limits of their own aircraft. Control stiffened. The ground rushed upward. Many broke off too late, narrowly escaping disaster. But not all encounters ended in escape. Some German pilots, determined to stop the Thunderbolt at any cost, pressed their attacks too long. In these moments, the air filled with fire and fragments. The Thunderbolt's guns roared, cutting through aircraft that strayed too close. Survival often depended on split-second decisions and sheer luck. On the ground, Airfields told a grim story. German bases grew quieter as aircraft numbers dwindled. Mechanics worked endlessly to keep aging planes airworthy. Pilots waited longer between missions, aware that each flight might be their last. The balance of experience tilted further toward the Allies with every passing week. Meanwhile, Thunderbolt pilots grew more confident. They had seen what their aircraft could endure. They trusted its armor, its firepower, and its ability to bring them home alive. Mission after mission hardened them, turning fear into focus. The P-47 was no longer just a machine. It was a lifeline, yet the cost of the air war weighed heavily on both sides. Pilots returned to base missing friends, haunted by images they could not forget. Victory came with exhaustion, and survival carried its own burden. The sky remained a place of constant danger, where even the strongest aircraft could be lost in an instant. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the pressure on the Luftwaffe reached a breaking point. The Thunderbolt continued to dominate low and medium altitudes, while new Allied fighters joined the fight at higher levels. The once mocked aircraft now stood at the center of a relentless campaign, and soon it would face a new challenge, not from the enemy alone, but from the changing nature of the war itself. As the war dragged into another brutal winter, the skies over Europe grew colder, darker, and far more unforgiving. Snow-covered airfields, winds howled across runways, and engines struggled to start in freezing temperatures. For pilots on both sides, survival now depended not only on skill and courage, but on endurance of both machine and mind. The P-47 Thunderbolt was tested like never before. Cold seeped into every crack of the cockpit. Oxygen masks froze. Fingers numbed around control sticks. Pilots flew for hours in conditions that pushed the limits of human tolerance, knowing that a single mechanical failure over enemy territory meant almost certain death. Yet the Thunderbolt kept flying. Its massive engine proved reliable in conditions that grounded other aircraft. Maintenance crews worked through the night, hands raw from cold, keeping the fighters ready for dawn missions. The aircraft's rugged design once again revealed its purpose. Not comfort, not elegance, but survival. German pilots faced a harsher reality. Fuel shortages worsened as supply lines collapsed under constant air attack. Flights were reduced, training nearly abandoned. New pilots were sent into combat with only a fraction of the experience their opponents possessed. Veteran Luftwaffe aces found themselves flying fewer missions, conserving precious fuel, watching the skies slowly slip from their control. Encounters in the winter skies were sudden and violent. Cloud, cover hit attackers until the last moment. Visibility vanished without warning. A comm patrol could turn into chaos in seconds as aircraft burst through the clouds at point-blank range. In these moments, instinct mattered more than training manuals. Thunderbolt pilots learned to trust the weight beneath them. They absorbed hits, stabilized damaged aircraft, and escaped through steep dives that no enemy dared to follow for long. Even when wounded, even when engines sputtered, many P-47s returned home, scarred but intact. On the ground, Allied troops began to feel the Thunderbolt's presence more directly. During major offensives, including the desperate fighting in winter campaigns, Thunderbolts struck enemy supply routes relentlessly. Roads turned into graveyards of destroyed vehicles. Bridges vanished. Reinforcements never arrived. Soldiers advancing through frozen terrain often found that resistance ahead had already been broken from the air. Morale shifted. Allied soldiers looked skyward with relief when they heard the deep, unmistakable roar of the P-47's engine. German troops reacted very differently, diving for cover, scattering, knowing what followed that sound. For the pilots, exhaustion became a constant companion. They flew mission after mission, carrying memories of lost friends and close calls. Sleep came in fragments. Faces aged quickly, yet they climbed back into their cockpits because the war demanded it, and because their aircraft gave them a chance, however small, to survive another day. By winter's end, it was clear the balance had shifted permanently. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of sustained resistance in the air. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as too large and too slow, had proven something far more important. It could fight in any condition, against any odds, and keep going when others could not. But the war was not yet over. As spring approached, the Thunderbolt would face its final and most demanding role, supporting the last push into the heart of enemy territory, where every mission carried the weight of ending the war. As the war dragged into another brutal winter, the skies over Europe grew colder, darker, and far more unforgiving. Snow covered airfields, winds howled across runways, and engines struggled to start in freezing temperatures. For pilots on both sides, survival now depended not only on skill and courage, but on endurance of both machine and mind. The P-47 Thunderbolt was tested like never before. Cold seeped into every crack of the cockpit. Oxygen masks froze. Fingers numbed around control sticks. Pilots flew for hours in conditions that pushed the limits of human tolerance, knowing that a single mechanical failure over enemy territory meant almost certain death. Yet the Thunderbolt kept flying. Its massive engine proved reliable in conditions that grounded other aircraft. Maintenance crews worked through the night, hands raw from cold, keeping the fighters ready for dawn missions. The aircraft's rugged design once again revealed its purpose. Not comfort, not elegance, but survival. German pilots faced a harsher reality. Fuel shortages worsened as supply lines collapsed under constant air attack. Flights were reduced, training nearly abandoned. New pilots were sent into combat with only a fraction of the experience their opponents possessed. Veteran Luftwaffe aces found themselves flying fewer missions, conserving precious fuel, watching the skies slowly slip from their control. Encounters in the winter skies were sudden and violent. Cloud, cover hit attackers until the last moment. Visibility vanished without warning. A comm patrol could turn into chaos in seconds as aircraft burst through the clouds at point-blank range. In these moments, instinct mattered more than training manuals. Thunderbolt pilots learned to trust the weight beneath them. They absorbed hits, stabilized damaged aircraft, and escaped through steep dives that no enemy dared to follow for long. Even when wounded, even when engines sputtered, many P-47s returned home, scarred but intact. On the ground, Allied troops began to feel the Thunderbolt's presence more directly. During major offensives, including the desperate fighting in winter campaigns, Thunderbolts struck enemy supply routes relentlessly. Roads turned into graveyards of destroyed vehicles. Bridges vanished. Reinforcements never arrived. Soldiers advancing through frozen terrain often found that resistance ahead had already been broken from the air. Morale shifted. Allied soldiers looked skyward with relief when they heard the deep, unmistakable roar of the P-47's engine. German troops reacted very differently, diving for cover, scattering, knowing what followed that sound. For the pilots, exhaustion became a constant companion. They flew mission after mission, carrying memories of lost friends and close calls. Sleep came in fragments. Faces aged quickly, yet they climbed back into their cockpits because the war demanded it, and because their aircraft gave them a chance, however small, to survive another day. By winter's end, it was clear the balance had shifted permanently. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of sustained resistance in the air. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as too large and too slow, had proven something far more important. It could fight in any condition, against any odds, and keep going when others could not. But the war was not yet over. As spring approached, the Thunderbolt would face its final and most demanding role, supporting the last push into the heart of enemy territory, where every mission carried the weight of ending the war. As Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe, the skies slowly began to change. The constant tension that once defined every mission gave way to something unfamiliar: silence. German fighters appeared less frequently, and when they did, they came in smaller numbers, often retreating before full engagement. For Thunderbolt pilots, this absence was not comforting. It was unsettling. The Luftwaffe was running out of strength. Airfields that once buzzed with activity now stood quiet. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft before they ever reached the runway. Spare parts were cannibalized from damaged planes to keep a few operational. Experienced pilots were stretched thin, flying only when absolutely necessary, while new pilots lacked the confidence and training to challenge Allied control of the air. Encounters that did occur felt different. German pilots no longer attacked with confidence. Their movements were cautious, defensive, sometimes hesitant. In several engagements, Thunderbolt pilots reported enemy aircraft breaking away at the first sign of resistance. The balance of fear had shifted completely, yet danger remained. Anti-aircraft fire still filled the sky over strategic targets. Flak crews, often composed of young soldiers and older men, fought with grim determination. Black bursts tore through the air, claiming aircraft without warning. The Thunderbolt's durability saved many lives, but not all. Losses continued, even as victory drew closer. For the pilots, the emotional weight grew heavier. They had flown dozens, sometimes hundreds of missions. Faces and squadron photos thinned as weeks passed. Empty bunks and unused lockers became silent reminders of those who would never return. Victory no longer felt triumphant. It felt exhausting. Ground attack missions continued relentlessly. Thunderbolt struck retreating columns, abandoned equipment, and isolated defensive positions. Roads were littered with wreckage. Rail lines twisted and broken. The war was visibly collapsing, piece by piece, under constant pressure from the air. On the ground, Allied soldiers advanced through towns scarred by years of occupation. Many later recalled seeing Thunderbolts circling overhead, watching silently, ready to strike if resistance appeared. The aircraft had become guardians as much as weapons. For German civilians and soldiers alike, daylight movement had become dangerous. The deep roar of the Thunderbolt's engine carried with it an unmistakable message. The war was lost, and there was no hiding from its final stages. Morale crumbled as the reality of defeat set in. In the air, Thunderbolt pilots felt something else entirely. They began to realize that the missions would soon end. The constant routine of briefing rooms, engine noise, and narrow escapes would give way to an uncertain future. Many wondered who they would be without the war, without the aircraft that had kept them alive. As resistance faded, the Thunderbolt continued to fly, not because it was needed for dominance, but because it was needed to finish the job. The storm was passing, but what followed would not be peace. It would be reflection, reckoning, and a long shadow left by years of conflict written across the sky. By the final months of the war in Europe, the skies carried a strange contradiction. The danger had not disappeared, yet the certainty of victory was now undeniable. Thunderbolt pilots flew knowing that each mission might be one of the last, a thought both comforting and unsettling. The aircraft that carried them through years of relentless combat was still needed, even as the enemy collapsed. The final missions were different. There were fewer intercepts, fewer sudden dogfights in clouds. Instead, the Thunderbolt's work became precise and methodical. Pilots targeted retreating units, abandoned airfields, and supply depots hastily left behind. The goal was no longer to gain control of the sky. It was to prevent any chance of recovery. German resistance was fragmented. Some units fought on stubbornly, clinging to orders that no longer matched reality. Others surrendered at the first sign of Allied presence. Thunderbolt pilots witnessed this confusion from above, watching columns scatter the sound of approaching engines, vehicles abandoned mid-road, weapons discarded in haste. Yet even in collapse, the war remained deadly. Anti-aircraft fire still rose from the ground, sporadic but unpredictable. Pilots could never relax, never assume safety. A single well-placed burst could still end a life, even in the final days. Several Thunderbolts were lost when victory was already in sight, a cruel reminder that war rarely grants clean endings. For the men in the cockpit, emotions ran deep, relief mixed with exhaustion. Hope collided with grief. They thought of friends who had not lived to see this moment, of missions that had gone wrong, of nights spent wondering if they would survive another day. The approaching end did not erase those memories. It sharpened them. On the ground, Allied troops advanced through territories once heavily defended. They found airfields littered with destroyed or abandoned German aircraft. Hangars stood empty. Control towers were silent. The Luftwaffe that once ruled the skies had effectively ceased to exist. The Thunderbolt continued to fly overhead, a constant presence even as combat faded. Pilots were instructed to remain vigilant, to complete every assignment with the same discipline as before. Complacency, they were reminded, could still kill. The aircraft that had survived so much continued to perform exactly as it had been built to do, protect its pilot and dominate its mission. Then came the first signs that the war was truly ending. Briefings grew shorter. targets fewer, missions canceled altogether. Squadrons began grounding aircraft for the first time in years, without replacing them the next morning. The silence felt unnatural. For many pilots, the final flight carried a weight unlike any other. They climbed into their cockpits, knowing it might be the last time. Engines roared, formations lifted into the sky, and then returned without incident. No enemy appeared, no guns fired. The war had simply stopped. As Thunderbolts rolled to a halt on quiet runways, pilots removed their helmets and sat in stillness, absorbing the reality of survival. The aircraft that had once been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed had carried them through the worst war the world had ever known. And now, its mission was nearly complete. When the war finally ended, the silence felt heavier than the noise had ever been. Airfields that once echoed with roaring engines and urgent commands now stood quiet under open skies. For the pilots of the P-47 Thunderbolt, survival brought relief, but it also brought questions they were not prepared to answer. Who were they without the war? The journey home was not a single moment, but a slow return to a world that had moved on. Trains carried pilots away from bases that had defined their lives. Uniforms were folded away. Flight jackets, once worn with pride, became reminders of years lived at the edge of death. Many pilots found it difficult to explain what they had experienced. How could they describe the fear of diving through flak, the sound of bullets striking metal inches from their bodies, or the sight of friends disappearing in the clouds they would never emerge from? Words fail where memories refuse to fade. The Thunderbolt itself became a symbol. To civilians, it was an aircraft, large, powerful, victorious. To the men who flew it, it was something far more personal. It was shelter in the sky. It was the reason they were alive. They remembered how it absorbed damage, how it carried them home when logic said it should not. Some pilots returned to flying. Others never stepped into a cockpit again. The sky, once their workplace, now felt distant. The habits of war lingered, listening for engines, scanning the horizon, waking from dreams shaped by noise and motion. Peace was not immediate. It had to be learned. Across former battlefields, wreckage remained. Burned-out vehicles, twisted rail lines, abandoned airfields. The physical scars of war faded slowly, but the human ones endured. In quiet moments, pilots remembered the missions that had shaped them, not as victories, but as tests of survival. Historians began to record the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt. They wrote about its size, its firepower, its durability. They analyzed statistics and production numbers. Yet numbers alone could not capture what the aircraft truly represented. Its legacy lived in the men who trusted it with their lives, who pushed it beyond limits and returned to tell the story. Reunions brought memories back to the surface. Pilots gathered years later, older now, sharing stories that only they could understand. They spoke of cold mornings, crowded briefings, and the sound of engines starting in unison. They laughed about moments of fear and fell silent when names were mentioned that never left their minds. For them, the Thunderbolt was never just history. It was a chapter of their lives written in noise, speed, and survival. A chapter that ended when the war did, but never truly closed. As time passed, fewer voices remained to tell the story firsthand. The responsibility of remembering began to shift from those who lived it to those who would learn from it. And with that shift came a question that history would continue to ask. How would the Thunderbolt be remembered when the men who flew it were gone? The answer would be shaped not only by facts and records, but by the legacy left behind in the skies of Europe, and in the lives saved by an aircraft once mocked, but never forgotten. When the guns finally fell silent and the skies of Europe returned to peace, the P-47 Thunderbolt faded from active duty, but not from history. The massive fighter that once thundered across battlefields was gradually replaced by newer machines, sleeker designs, and faster engines. Yet its story did not end on the runway. It lived on in memory. The Thunderbolt had never been beautiful in the traditional sense. It was not designed to impress on first glance. It did not rely on elegance or finesse. Instead, it embodied something far more enduring, resilience. In a war defined by extremes, the P-47 represented survival against overwhelming odds. It proved that strength, endurance, and reliability could matter more than speed alone. German pilots had laughed at it once. They had seen its size and assumed weakness. But history showed otherwise. The Thunderbolt outlasted them. It escorted bombers when losses were unbearable. It struck supply lines when ground forces needed relief. It protected pilots when escape seemed impossible. Again and again, it returned from missions scarred but flying. For the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt was never just an aircraft. It was trust forged in combat. It was a weight beneath them in a dive that meant survival. It was the sound of an engine that still ran after taking damage. No fighter should survive. Many pilots later said the same thing in different words. They believed the Thunderbolt wanted to bring them home. That belief mattered. In war, confidence can be as powerful as any weapon. Knowing their aircraft could endure allowed pilots to focus, to fight, and to return. That confidence shaped outcomes not only in the air, but on the ground, where entire battles were influenced by the Thunderbolt's presence. History would later measure the P-47 in numbers. Thousands built, thousands of sorties flown, enemy aircraft destroyed, vehicles eliminated, missions completed. Yet behind every statistic was a human story. A pilot gripping the controls, a crew waiting on the ground, a life altered by seconds in the sky. As years passed, the Thunderbolt found its place in museums, memorials, and photographs. Visitors stood beneath its wings, marveling at its size, reading plaques that summarized its role in a few sentences. But no display could fully convey what it meant to those who flew into combat, who trusted it with their lives when the world was falling apart. The true legacy of the Thunderbolt lies not in metal or engines. It lies in the lives it saved, in the missions it completed when failure was not an option, in the reminder that underestimation can be fatal and resilience can change history. World War II reshaped the world in ways still felt today. Among its countless stories, the P-47 Thunderbolt stands as a testament to endurance in the face of destruction and to the quiet truth that sometimes the strongest force is the one that refuses to fall. And so, the aircraft once mocked in the skies earned its place in history, not through laughter, but through survival.